Title: The Shadow That Follows. Chapter 1: A Meeting in the Library. Eduardo Martinez, a young writer with dreams of fame, arrived at the Ortega Library one rainy evening, his coat soaked and dripping from the unrelenting storm outside. He had been invited to meet Santiago Blanco, a man whose very name carried a ghostly weight in the world of literature. Santiago was notorious for his eerie novels, tales woven from darkness and mystery, stories that whispered to those willing to listen. And though he was reclusive, the aging author had specifically asked to see Eduardo. The library felt unsettlingly silent, each sound dulled by the rain pounding against the windows. As Eduardo walked deeper into the maze of bookshelves, the scent of old, musty paper filled his nostrils, mingling with the dampness in his clothes. Shadows danced along the walls, their strange shapes flickering as the overhead lights struggled to stay alive. He finally arrived at the dimly lit study room where Santiago had promised to meet him. The room itself seemed ancient, untouched by time. Dust clung to the air, floating lazily through thin shafts of light. But there, seated at the end of a long, dark wooden table, was Santiago Blanco himself. His thin frame was cloaked in a heavy coat, his face obscured by the brim of a worn hat, leaving only his eyes visible, sharp, piercing, and holding an unsettling glimmer. "Mr. Martinez," Santiago's voice was low and gravelly, as if his throat had been scorched by years of silent suffering. "I've been expecting you." Eduardo felt a chill crawl up his spine. He forced a polite smile and nodded, taking a seat across from Santiago. He'd imagined this moment countless times, the chance to speak with his literary idol. But now that he was here, he felt a prickling unease, as though he were intruding on some forbidden place. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Blanco," Eduardo began. But Santiago's gaze didn't waver. He merely tilted his head, as if studying Eduardo, peeling back layers with his intense stare. "You have ambition, don't you, Mr. Martinez?" Santiago asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eduardo swallowed, taken aback by the question. I suppose so, yes. I admire your work, Mr. Blanco. I've always hoped to understand your inspiration. Your characters, they feel so real, so alive. As if..." He trailed off, unsure how to describe the haunting familiarity he felt when reading Santiago's stories. Santiago's lips twisted into a cold, almost mocking smile, as if they're walking alongside you. Eduardo blinked, unnerved by the accuracy of Santiago's words. He hadn't voiced that exact feeling, but it was true. Reading Santiago's books felt like an intrusion into a forbidden world. A world where the dead wandered, where shadows held memories of things long gone. "Yes," Eduardo admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Exactly like that." For a long, painful moment, Santiago remained silent, his gaze fixed on Eduardo with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through him. The room felt colder, the shadows around them deepening, as though the darkness itself were pressing in. Then, slowly, Santiago leaned forward, his voice dropping to a barely audible murmur. "Mr. Martinez, I want you to listen very closely. There is someone, who wanders." Eduardo's heart skipped a beat, and he leaned in, his curiosity now tinged with dread. "Wanders," he repeated, his voice trembling. Santiago's eyes narrowed. "Yes, a figure, a shadow if you will. He is known as El que deambula, he who wanders. Those who meet him rarely live to tell the tale, and those who do, well, they carry a mark he leaves behind." Eduardo felt the chill spread through his entire body. A mark? What kind of mark? Santiago's lips thinned, a sense of dread, of being watched, a curse that makes them feel his presence in every corner, every shadow. The wanderer appears first as a fleeting glimpse, a figure at the edge of your vision, one that vanishes when you try to focus on it. Then, he begins to draw closer, step by step, until he is nearly beside you. Santiago's voice was a barely audible rasp, and the worst part is, no matter where you run, he finds you. Eduardo shivered, his mouth dry, but he forced himself to speak. "You say those who do live to tell. So are you saying that you..." Santiago nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Yes, I saw him once, long ago. And since then, I've been careful, always moving, always staying in public places. I knew that one day he would find me again. He paused, his gaze darkening. But I don't know why he chose me. And now, Mr. Martinez, I have chosen you. Eduardo's heart began to pound. The words felt like an accusation, a weight pressing down on him. What do you mean? Santiago's eyes bore into his. You will see him too, and when he comes, you will understand. Santiago's voice was filled with an eerie certainty. You are a writer, Mr. Martinez, and writers have a way of opening doors they shouldn't. Eduardo's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table, fear pooling in his stomach. This couldn't be real. It had to be some elaborate test, a game Santiago was playing to see if he could frighten him. But as he looked into Santiago's eyes, he felt the weight of something dark, something deeply unsettling. Without another word, Santiago rose from his seat, his thin frame towering over Eduardo. Remember this, Mr. Martinez. Once you have seen him, he will never stop following you. He will become your shadow, your silent companion. Eduardo watched as Santiago turned and disappeared into the shadows of the library, his figure swallowed by the darkness, leaving Eduardo alone in the cold silence. The only sound was the soft rustling of the pages around him, whispering secrets of a world he suddenly wished he had never entered. He sat there for a long time, staring into the shadows, half expecting the figure Santiago described to appear right there and then. He could feel the weight of invisible eyes upon him, a phantom presence lingering just beyond his reach. As he finally rose to leave, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The lights flickered, casting dark, twisted shadows that danced along the walls, shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. And for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something, a figure at the edge of his vision, just as Santiago had described. It was faint, almost invisible, but unmistakably there, watching him with eyes that burned with an unseen fire. Eduardo left the library that night with a sense of dread he could not shake, the echo of Santiago's words reverberating through his mind. Once you have seen him, he will never stop following you. Chapter 2. The First Sight. After the meeting with Santiago, Eduardo couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every time he stepped out into the street or entered a crowded cafe, he felt a pair of unseen eyes tracking his every move. His days had grown tense, filled with shadows that seemed to linger just a moment too long, corners of his vision that twisted with shapes that faded when he looked directly at them. He tried to brush it off, to convince himself that Santiago's warning was just a ghost story told to test his nerves. After all, Santiago was known for his twisted tales and dark imagination. Perhaps it had been some perverse initiation into the literary world, a way to introduce Eduardo to his strange, haunted world. But that creeping dread never left, growing stronger with every day that passed since the meeting. One evening, as Eduardo was walking home, he passed by an old park, the rusty gate creaking in the wind. His heart pounded as he caught sight of something unusual, a figure standing beneath a tree at the edge of the park, just barely visible in the shadows. The figure was tall and slender, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the gloom. But what struck Eduardo was its stance. It was leaning slightly, as if its body were heavy on one side, and there, near its shoulder, was a head tilted at an unnatural angle. Eduardo blinked, thinking it might be a trick of the light, a play of shadows cast by the dim street lamp above. But the figure remained, motionless, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness, just bright enough to catch his attention. A jolt of fear shot through him. The figure wasn't moving, but somehow he knew it was watching him. His heart raced, his body frozen in place, unable to move or look away. He could only stare back at the figure, its eerie, glowing eyes unblinking, filled with something dark, something ancient. Slowly, the figure raised one hand, fingers outstretched, pointing directly at him. Eduardo's breath caught, and he felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee from whatever had fixed its gaze upon him. Yet his feet refused to obey. He felt as if he were rooted to the ground, trapped in the gaze of something beyond his understanding. His mind raced back to Santiago's words. Once you have seen him, he will never stop following you. At that thought, his paralysis broke, and he stumbled backward, heart pounding wildly. He turned and bolted down the street, not daring to glance back. As he ran, he could swear he heard footsteps behind him, soft, measured steps that matched his own. He could feel the shadow's presence drawing closer, closing in like a predator stalking its prey. Eduardo didn't stop running until he reached his apartment building, bursting through the door and locking it behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands trembled as he pressed his back against the wall, listening for any sound outside. But there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. For a few moments he stood there, his mind racing, questioning whether he had imagined it all. But the memory of those glowing eyes, of that bony finger pointing directly at him, lingered like a scar, etched into his mind. He went to the window and peered outside, his hands shaking as he pulled back the curtain. The street was empty, washed in pale moonlight, the buildings casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. There was no sign of the figure, but Eduardo's fear didn't lessen. He felt its presence in the shadows, just beyond sight, watching and waiting. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those glowing eyes staring back at him, cold and unfeeling, as if marking him. He tossed and turned, plagued by visions of twisted shapes and shadowy figures, his mind haunted by Santiago's words and the feeling that he was never truly alone. Over the next few days, Eduardo's life took on a surreal quality. He went about his daily routines, but nothing felt normal. The world around him seemed warped, as if reality itself had shifted. Shadows grew darker, lingering longer, and he caught glimpses of movement from the corners of his eyes. But whenever he turned, he found nothing. Once, in a crowded cafe, he thought he saw the figure reflected in the window, its head tilted at that unnatural angle, those same eyes glinting in the glass. He whipped around, searching the room, but there was no one there who looked like the shadowed figure. The patrons around him were oblivious, sipping coffee and chatting as if nothing was wrong. But Eduardo's heart raced, his skin cold with terror. His friends noticed his change, asking if he was all right, if he needed a break from his writing. Eduardo wanted to tell them, to explain the figure that haunted him, but the words wouldn't come. How could he tell them that he was being followed by something unnatural, something that lived in the shadows and stalked him from every corner? The worst moment came one night as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with fear and paranoia. The room was dark, silent save for the ticking of the clock on his wall. He tried to reassure himself, tried to push the memory of the figure out of his mind. But sleep refused to come. Then from the darkness, he heard a sound, a soft, deliberate step, followed by another, and another, coming from the hallway outside his bedroom. His blood ran cold as he listened, paralyzed by fear. The steps were slow, dragging, each one echoing in his ears like a death knell. The handle on his bedroom door twisted, the creak filling the silence like a scream. Eduardo lay still, his breath shallow, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would give him away. The door opened a crack, and through the sliver of darkness, he could make out a faint glow, those same eerie eyes he had seen in the park, watching him from the gap. Eduardo squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear, praying that whatever it was would leave him alone. He lay like that for what felt like hours, his body rigid with fear, until he finally mustered the courage to open his eyes. The figure was gone, the door closed, the room empty. But Eduardo knew, deep down, that he wasn't safe. The shadow was there, lurking just beyond sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. And as he lay in bed, staring into the darkness, he understood that Santiago's warning had not been a tale meant to frighten him. It had been a truth, a dark truth that now clung to him, following him with every step he took. The shadow was real, and it would not stop until it had claimed him. Chapter 3. Encounters in the Night. The days that followed were a waking nightmare for Eduardo. The figure had become a constant presence in his life, lurking just beyond sight, creeping closer with each passing hour. He felt its gaze on him no matter where he was, in crowded rooms, empty streets, even in the sanctuary of his own apartment. The air around him grew thick with dread, and a heavy tension seemed to press down on him, weighing on his every step. But it was the nights that brought the worst of it. As darkness settled, Eduardo's senses heightened, his mind constantly scanning for signs of the figure's return. His apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. its shadows twisting and expanding as though eager to swallow him whole. One particular night, Eduardo lay awake in bed, his heart pounding as he stared into the darkness. He tried to calm himself, to rationalize the terror gripping his mind, but his thoughts were haunted by the memory of that half-open door, the faint glow of eyes watching him from the shadows. Every creak, every whisper of wind against his window felt like footsteps, like the shadow closing in on him. Then he heard it again, a soft, dragging sound coming from the hallway. His breath caught, his body freezing with terror as he strained to listen. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if whatever lurked outside was savoring every moment, relishing the fear it was sowing. Eduardo's mind screamed at him to hide, to pull the covers over his head and pretend it wasn't real. But he couldn't look away. He couldn't tear his gaze from the door, knowing that the figure was just beyond it, waiting. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside his bedroom. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick and suffocating, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tense, his heart hammering in his chest. The door creaked, opening just a sliver, and there it was again. Those glowing eyes, watching him from the darkness, unblinking, filled with a twisted curiosity. The figure's face was still obscured, but its eyes held him captive, a cruel and mocking stare that sent a wave of terror crashing over him. Eduardo squeezed his eyes shut, his mind racing, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would betray him. He lay like that, motionless, praying that the figure would go away, that it would leave him in peace. When he finally opened his eyes, the door was closed and the room was empty once more. But Eduardo knew the figure hadn't left. It was still there, lurking just beyond sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself fully. His nights became an endless cycle of fear and paranoia. The figure would appear at random, a shadow at the edge of his vision, a face in a darkened window, a whisper of movement behind him. It was always watching, always waiting, drawing closer with every encounter. Sleep became a distant memory, his body and mind worn down by the constant terror. Eduardo tried to tell himself that it was all in his head, that the figure was just a hallucination born of exhaustion and fear. But deep down, he knew it was real. He could feel its presence, a cold and malevolent energy that clung to him like a second skin. And so he continued his silent, terrified vigil, haunted by the knowledge that he was never truly alone. Chapter 4. Seeking Answers. As days melted into weeks, Eduardo realized that he could no longer bear the relentless haunting alone. The figure's presence had consumed his life, leaving him a shell of the person he once was, his mind fractured and twisted by fear. He knew he needed answers, needed to understand what this figure was and why it had chosen him. His thoughts drifted back to Santiago Blanco, the man who had warned him of he who wanders, the man who had vanished without a trace. Santiago was the only one who could help him, the only one who knew the truth about the shadow that haunted him. Determined to find some trace of the author, Eduardo returned to the Ortega library, where Santiago had last been seen. The library was silent and empty, its rows of books standing like silent sentinels, their covers worn and dusty. Eduardo moved cautiously, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows, but the library was devoid of any supernatural presence, at least for now. He made his way to Santiago's study room, where they had met on that fateful night. The room was untouched, as if frozen in time, the table still littered with yellowed papers and half-finished notes. Eduardo rifled through them, searching for anything that might explain Santiago's disappearance or the nature of the figure that pursued him. At last, he found it, an old leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Santiago's handwriting. The ink was faded, but the words were legible, and as Eduardo read, a chilling realization dawned on him. The journal was a detailed account of Santiago's own haunting by the figure, a tale eerily similar to Eduardo's. Santiago described a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, a presence that stalked him relentlessly, appearing at random, always at the edge of his vision. He wrote of sleepless nights, of the terror that gnawed at him, of the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to him like a curse. But Santiago's journal went deeper, revealing a sinister truth that Eduardo had never suspected. The figure, he who wanders, was not merely a spectre or a ghost, it was a creature of darkness, a manifestation of guilt and regret, drawn to those who harbored dark secrets or hidden sins. Eduardo's hands trembled as he read the final pages, where Santiago wrote of a ritual, an ancient ceremony said to bind the figure to a specific location to prevent it from following its chosen victim. But the ritual was risky, requiring the person to confront the figure directly, to face the darkest parts of themselves. Santiago's last entry was a warning, a final plea to anyone who found the journal. Do not attempt to bind it, do not confront it unless you are ready to see the truth within yourself. He who wanders is not a mere apparition. He is a mirror, a reflection of everything you fear, everything you regret, and once you face him, there is no going back. Eduardo closed the journal, his hands shaking, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He understood now that the figure was more than just a ghost. It was a part of him, a manifestation of his own guilt, his own hidden sins, and the only way to escape it was to confront it, to face whatever darkness lay buried within him. But as he left the library, he felt a chill creep over him, a sense of foreboding that settled deep in his bones. He knew that by searching for answers, he had only drawn the figure closer. It was no longer content to watch him from the shadows. It was preparing to reveal itself fully, to confront him in all its twisted, nightmarish glory. As he stepped out into the cold night air, Eduardo felt its presence beside him, a shadow stretching out from his own feet, merging with the darkness around him. The figure was there, silent and patient, waiting for him to take the next step, to make the decision that would seal his fate. He had a choice now, to flee and live in fear, or to confront the figure, to stare into the eyes of the nightmare that haunted him. But the thought of facing it, of seeing what lay beneath those glowing eyes, filled him with a terror he had never known. And as he walked down the empty street, his footsteps echoing in the silence, he felt the figure drawing closer, its presence pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. It was only a matter of time before it stepped out of the shadows, before it revealed the truth he had been running from. And in that moment, Eduardo understood that he was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted, a man marked by the darkness within himself, a man haunted by the shadow of his own soul. Chapter 5. A Sinister Pattern. Eduardo's discovery of Santiago's journal cast a chilling light on his own haunting. He who wanders, the shadow that had stalked him, was not a mere apparition, but something darker, a reflection of himself, a creature that seemed to feed on guilt and secrets. Every word Santiago had written now felt like a grim prophecy, an account of what awaited Eduardo if he couldn't escape. Days passed in a fog of fear and dread. Eduardo couldn't escape the feeling that his life was spiraling into Santiago's footsteps, as though he were reliving another man's nightmare. It seemed that his very thoughts, the memories he'd kept buried for so long, were drawing the figure closer. The figure no longer lurked only at night. It began to appear at all hours, manifesting in increasingly unsettling ways. One evening, Eduardo met with his friend Tomás, hoping for some distraction from the unending fear. They chose a dimly lit bar in the heart of the city, a place Eduardo thought might be crowded enough to offer him a sense of safety. But as they settled at their table, Eduardo's mind began to wander. Shadows twisted in the dim light, dark shapes slipping in and out of his peripheral vision. "Eduardo, are you listening?" Tomás asked, breaking Eduardo's trance. Eduardo blinked, forcing himself to focus on Tomás's concerned expression. "Sorry, I've just been distracted lately." Tomás gave him a sympathetic look. "You look exhausted. What's going on with you?" Eduardo hesitated. How could he explain the shadow that followed him, the figure that haunted his every step? But as he opened his mouth to speak, a dark shape appeared in the mirror behind Tomás, barely visible, a tall, thin figure with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Eduardo's heart stopped. He glanced quickly around, but no one else seemed to see it. They continued their conversations, oblivious to the figure lurking in their midst. It was there for just a moment, but he could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, fixed directly on him. Panic surged in his chest, and he bolted from the bar, leaving Tomás calling after him in confusion. Outside, Eduardo gasped for air, his hands shaking as he backed away from the entrance. He had thought he could avoid the figure, that it only haunted him in solitude, in moments of weakness. But now it had followed him into a crowded space, a place where he had once felt safe. He couldn't escape it. It was everywhere he went. A dreadful thought gripped him. It would follow him until he confronted his own secrets. But what secrets? What memories could have drawn such darkness to him? Eduardo returned to his apartment in a haze of terror, the shadows in his room shifting with unnatural movement. He was no longer safe anywhere. As he lay in bed that night, the darkness seemed to close in, whispering his name, the figure's silent presence stretching closer. Eduardo felt his sanity slipping, his mind consumed by fear. And as sleep finally claimed him, he dreamed of a place shrouded in mist, a place he had tried to forget, a narrow path on a hillside, and the faint image of a figure lying still on the ground, bathed in moonlight. He awoke in a sweat, his heart pounding, a single name echoing in his mind: Luis. Chapter 6. The Burden of Memory. The name Luis haunted Eduardo. He hadn't thought about his friend Luis in years, not since that night, the night he had buried deep within himself. The details were hazy, locked away in the recesses of his memory, but bits and pieces began to slip through the cracks, unwelcome and chilling. Luis had been his childhood friend, someone who had shared in his dreams and schemes, his laughter and sorrow. But their friendship had ended abruptly, shattered by a night Eduardo had long tried to forget. It was a night of recklessness, of whispered dares and drunken boasts. He remembered climbing the hillside near their hometown, challenging each other to feats of courage. Eduardo had left the hillside that night, his mind clouded by alcohol and adrenaline, unaware that Luis had stayed behind, unaware that his friend had never made it home. Now, the memories came flooding back with painful clarity. The body of his friend had been found the next morning, broken and lifeless at the base of the hill. Eduardo had told himself it was an accident, that Luis must have slipped in the dark, but guilt had gnawed at him. He knew deep down that if he hadn't dared Luis to climb that hill, his friend would still be alive. Eduardo had buried the memory, had convinced himself that it was not his fault, but now, in the darkness, he felt the weight of his guilt, pressing down on him like a physical force, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he who wanders had been drawn to that guilt. The figure was not a mere phantom, but the embodiment of everything Eduardo had tried to bury. His guilt, his shame, had manifested into something terrible, something relentless that would not rest until he faced the truth. That night, as Eduardo lay in bed, he felt the figure's presence more strongly than ever. It stood at the edge of his bed, its shadow stretching over him like a shroud, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Eduardo couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped under the weight of his own guilt. In the silence, he heard a voice, soft and mocking, that seemed to echo from within his own mind. "You left him there, didn't you? You walked away and never looked back." Eduardo's throat closed, his chest tightening with terror. The figure's voice was cold, cruel, echoing his darkest thoughts, his worst fears. It took a step closer, and Eduardo felt its presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. "You can't escape me," it whispered. "You've carried me with you all these years, hidden me in the shadows. But I am part of you now, Eduardo. I am everything you've tried to forget." Eduardo shut his eyes, trembling as he fought to silence the voice. But the figure's words burrowed deep, stirring memories he had tried to lock away. And he knew that there was no escaping it, no running from the darkness within himself. Chapter 7. Santiago's Journal. Desperate for guidance, Eduardo returned to the library, clutching Santiago's journal with white-knuckled fingers. He had hoped that by leaving the journal behind, he could distance himself from the shadow, but now he realized that the journal was his only hope. Santiago's words had haunted him, their warnings echoing in his mind, yet he sensed there might be something more, a hidden truth that could help him escape. In the dim light of the library, he pored over Santiago's entries, searching for any hint, any clue. He read of Santiago's own encounters with He Who Wanders, how he had tried to evade the figure by moving constantly, staying in the safety of crowds. But it hadn't been enough. The figure had still followed him, watching him from every shadow. And then he found it, a passage buried near the end of the journal, written in Santiago's unsteady hand. The figure is not bound to a place, but to a person. It attaches itself to those whose guilt runs deep, whose sins cling to them like a second skin. It cannot be exorcised or banished by any ritual. It will follow until it is faced, until the bearer confronts the darkness within. Eduardo's hands trembled as he read the words, a sickening dread rising in his chest. The figure could not be defeated or destroyed. It could only be faced. Santiago had written that the only way to free oneself from the figure's grasp was to confront the truth, to stand before it and accept the burden of one's actions. But Eduardo didn't know if he had the strength. The memory of Luis's death weighed on him like a leaden shroud, the shame and guilt of that night overwhelming him. How could he face that truth? How could he stand before the shadow and accept his own responsibility? As he closed the journal, Eduardo felt a chill creep over him, a familiar, suffocating presence closing in. He looked up, and there, in the darkened corner of the library, stood the figure, watching him with those cold, unfeeling eyes. Eduardo's heart pounded as he rose from his seat, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he knew that running would only make it worse, that the figure would follow him to the ends of the earth if necessary. Taking a shaky breath, he turned to face the shadow, his hands clenched at his sides. And as he looked into those glowing eyes, he saw his own reflection staring back at him. A twisted, haunted version of himself that bore the weight of every lie, every secret. He knew, in that moment, that he could no longer hide from the darkness within him. The time had come to face his sins, to confront the shadow that had haunted him for so long. And as the figure stepped closer, Eduardo felt his courage falter, his resolve weakening. He had come this far, but now, standing face to face with his own guilt, he wasn't sure he had the strength to see it through. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The library grew colder as Eduardo stared into the shadow's eyes, a reflection of his own guilt staring back at him, hollow and unyielding. It was as though he were gazing into a twisted, distorted version of himself, one moulded by every dark memory, every regret he'd buried over the years. His own eyes reflected in those of the shadow, revealing a depth of darkness he had never dared confront. Eduardo's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and rapid. The figure took a step closer, its presence filling the space with a suffocating dread. Its hand, thin and skeletal, reached out slowly, stretching toward him. He froze, his feet rooted to the ground, unable to move as the figure's icy fingers grazed his shoulder, sending a chill through his entire body. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to shift, the library dissolving into a blur of shadows and flickering light. He was no longer in the library. He found himself on a misty hillside, his childhood self standing beside Luis, his old friend, and hearing his own voice, taunting, daring, urging Luis to climb higher. Luis's face was pale, nervous, but he went along with Eduardo's dare, laughing it off. Eduardo remembered that laughter, forced and uneasy, the laughter of someone trying to hide their fear. And then came the worst part. Eduardo turning his back on Luis, leaving him alone on that dark hill as he stumbled away, laughing into the night. Then the memory shifted, twisting around him, and he was standing on the hillside the next morning, staring down at Luis's lifeless body, crumpled at the base of the hill. His friend's once bright eyes were open, staring blankly into the sky, his face a pale mask of terror. Eduardo tried to look away, but the memory held him captive. He could feel the weight of that morning, the sickening realization that his actions had led to his friend's death, the shame he had buried so deeply. He remembered the funeral, the quiet whispers of his classmates, the cold stares from Luis's family, and he remembered the hollow promise he made to himself that day, to never think of Luis again, to lock that night away and leave it forgotten. But now, the shadow forced him to relive every second of it, to confront the truth he had tried to escape. He felt as though his soul were being ripped open, his heart laid bare. The figure's hand rested on his shoulder, pressing down with the weight of his guilt, binding him to the darkness within himself. A voice, cold and emotionless, echoed in his mind. "This is your burden, Eduardo. This is the truth you have hidden. And until you accept it, I will follow you to the ends of the earth." Eduardo's knees buckled, his body collapsing under the weight of the figure's words. He was a coward, a man who had abandoned his friend, a man haunted by the memory of a life cut short by his own actions. But even as the darkness closed in, he felt a faint flicker of resistance. Somewhere deep within him, a voice whispered that he could break free, that he could escape this endless nightmare. With a shaky breath, Eduardo forced himself to stand, meeting the shadow's gaze with a newfound determination. "I was wrong," he said aloud, his voice trembling. "I can't change what happened, but I can stop running. I accept what I did." The figure's eyes flashed, its form trembling as though it were being torn apart. Eduardo felt the weight on his shoulders lessen, the grip of guilt loosening its hold. The shadow let out a low, agonizing wail, its face contorting in rage and sorrow. And then it was gone, leaving Eduardo alone in the empty library, his heart pounding with relief. But he knew it wasn't over yet. This was only the beginning. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. Despite his moment of courage, the figure continued to haunt Eduardo, its presence more insistent and vengeful than before. It was as though his confession had only fueled its anger, intensifying its resolve. Eduardo tried to brace himself, to stand firm against the shadow's relentless pursuit, but every encounter left him weaker, more vulnerable, as if the figure were draining his very life. Days turned into sleepless nights, his mind and body battered by the unyielding fear that now consumed him. He could feel the shadow's rage building, its hatred festering as it grew stronger. Each time he glimpsed it in the corner of his vision, it looked clearer, more tangible, its eyes glowing brighter, burning with a fierce, unholy light. Eduardo knew that the time had come. There was no escaping the truth. He would have to confront the shadow fully, to face it head-on, or be consumed by it. The memory of Luis, his friend's silent, accusing eyes, haunted his every step, and he knew he would find no peace until he atoned for what he had done. One cold, stormy night, Eduardo returned to the hillside where Luis had died. The wind howled through the trees, rain pouring down in sheets, but he stood firm, his eyes fixed on the twisted path that led up the hill. He could feel the shadow's presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to take that final step. With a steadying breath, Eduardo climbed the hill, each step weighted with memories and regret. When he reached the top, he stopped, his heart pounding as he stared into the darkness, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm here," he called out, his voice trembling. "Show yourself." The wind fell silent, the rain slowing to a whisper, and then, from the shadows, the figure emerged. It moved slowly, each step deliberate, its form shifting and twisting, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. Eduardo stood his ground, his fear almost paralyzing, but he held on, refusing to look away. The figure stepped closer, stopping just inches from him. Its face was a distorted mirror of his own, twisted with anger and sorrow. Eduardo felt a surge of terror, but he forced himself to speak, his voice steady. "I know what you are. You're my guilt, my shame. You're the memory I tried to bury, and I can't run from you anymore." The figure's eyes flared, its hand reaching out to touch him, but Eduardo didn't move. He stood still, accepting its touch, accepting the weight of his actions. And as he did, the figure's form began to waver, its features blurring, dissolving into the night. Eduardo felt a sense of peace wash over him, a release from the burden he had carried for so long. He closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over him, feeling the presence of the shadow fade into nothingness. But when he opened his eyes, he saw something that made his heart stop. Standing where the figure had been was Luis, his face pale and solemn, his eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. "Luis," Eduardo whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Luis looked at him, his expression softening, and for the first time, Eduardo saw forgiveness in his friend's eyes. Luis nodded, a faint, sad smile on his lips, and then he too faded into the night, leaving Eduardo alone on the hillside, free from the shadow's grasp. To Chapter 10. Breaking Free. Eduardo stumbled through the front door of his home that night, his body and mind drained, yet somehow lighter than he had felt in years. The weight of guilt that had haunted him like a persistent spectre was finally lifted, replaced by a quiet acceptance that coursed through his veins. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment, breathing in the familiar sense of home. Wood polish, a hint of lavender from the air freshener, and the faint aroma of the dinner he had missed. Each scent reminded him that he was still alive, still anchored in the world, no longer adrift in a sea of despair. The night had been a revelation. After years of being shadowed by his past, he had confronted the very darkness that had kept him in its grip. It had taken the form of a haunting figure, a silhouette of pain and regret that had relentlessly pursued him since that fateful day. He could still see Luis's face, full of life, full of laughter, haunting him with unspoken words and accusations. But now, standing in the dim light of his hallway, Eduardo felt a profound sense of peace washing over him. He had looked into the eyes of that shadow, and for the first time, he had not flinched. In the days that followed, Eduardo began to rebuild his life, brick by brick, reconnecting with the friends and family he had distanced himself from during his dark years. He reached out to his childhood friends, those who had shared laughter and joy before grief and guilt had clouded his world. The first call was the hardest, his heart pounding in his chest as he dialed the number he had memorized but had been too afraid to call. When his friend Emma answered, her surprise quickly melted into warmth, and they spent hours reminiscing about their youth, laughter punctuating the conversation like firecrackers. Each reconnection felt like a victory, a small triumph over the darkness that had loomed so large in his life. He went out for coffee with old friends, shared meals with family, and attended gatherings that he had once avoided. He found joy in the simple things again. The way sunlight danced through the leaves of the oak tree in his backyard, the sound of laughter spilling from his nephew as they played in the park, and the warmth of his mother's embrace, which felt like coming home after a long journey. Yet, even as he moved forward, the memory of the shadow lingered, a quiet echo in the back of his mind. It had not returned, but he knew it could. The figure that had haunted him was now a part of his past that he had finally laid to rest. Yet the lessons he had learned from that darkness would remain with him forever. Eduardo understood that everyone carried shadows within them, burdens of memories and regrets that could consume them if left unchecked. With each passing day, he made a conscious effort to confront those shadows, not just within himself, but in the lives of those he loved. He became a listener, a confidant, always ready to lend an ear to friends who faced their own demons. He realized that sharing stories of pain could lighten the burden, that facing one's fears was a universal struggle, one that could bind people together in their shared humanity. In quiet moments, Eduardo would think of Luis, remembering their childhood adventures, their dreams of conquering the world, their laughter ringing out like music. He no longer viewed Luis's memory as a burden, but as a guiding light that illuminated his path forward. He carried Luis with him, a silent reminder of the man he had become, the strength he had found in facing the darkest corners of his soul. The shadow that had once threatened to consume him had become a teacher, imparting invaluable lessons that shaped his perspective on life. He learned to embrace the darkness, to acknowledge it as a part of his story rather than something to be feared. Instead of running from his emotions, he confronted them head-on, understanding that vulnerability was a sign of strength. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eduardo stood in his backyard, watching the last rays of light disappear behind the trees. He felt a sense of gratitude wash over him, a deep appreciation for the journey he had taken. The darkness had shaped him, yes, but it had also shown him the beauty of resilience, the strength that lay in vulnerability. As he stood there, he felt a soft breeze brush against his skin, a gentle caress that felt almost like a whisper. In that moment, he knew that the lessons of the shadow would remain with him forever. They were not just echoes of pain, but reminders of the journey toward healing. Eduardo smiled, a genuine smile filled with hope. He understood now that the only way to escape the darkness was not to run from it, but to embrace it. He would carry that knowledge with him, a quiet whisper in the night that guided him toward the light. The shadow was gone, but it had left behind the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With a heart full of gratitude, Eduardo turned away from the fading sunset, ready to embrace the future. He had faced his darkness, and in doing so, he had found the light within. He would continue to honor Luis's memory, not as a haunting spectre, but as a beacon of hope guiding him on his journey. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Eduardo felt truly free.